Pay attention to what you're about to see. This is surveillance footage from a pharmacy parking lot in Seattle, Washington. November 2016. Watch the man in the blue jacket getting out of his car. Notice how he discards something into the trash can by the entrance. A tissue. Just a tissue. But pay close attention to that moment, because that single piece of evidence is about to crack open one of the most terrifying criminal cases in American history. A case that spanned 4 decades. A predator who thought he'd gotten away with it. And a breakthrough that would change criminal investigation forever. You know that feeling when you're home alone at night and you hear a sound you can't quite place? Your heart skips a beat, you freeze, you listen. For most of us, it's nothing. A settling house, a neighbor's dog. We laugh it off and go back to sleep. But for hundreds of families across Northern California between 2003 and 2015, that sound wasn't nothing. It was someone in their home. Someone who'd been watching them. Someone who knew their schedules, their routines, their vulnerabilities. They called him the Shadow Hunter. Let me paint you a picture of what terror really looks like. Imagine this. You wake up in the middle of the night with a flashlight in your face. There's a masked man standing over your bed. He's holding a gun. He's whispering in a cold, controlled voice, telling you exactly what he's going to do. And here's what made it even more horrific. He seemed to know everything about you. Where you worked, what time you came home, whether you lived alone or with someone. This wasn't random. This was calculated. This was methodical. And for 12 years, nobody could stop him. The Shadow Hunter terrorized communities from Sacramento to San Diego. He started as a burglar, breaking into homes while families slept, stealing small items like cash and jewelry. But then something changed. The burglaries escalated into something far darker, sexual assaults. Then, in 2007, murder. 51 women assaulted, 13 people murdered, 120 homes violated, and not a single solid lead on who he was. Until 2016, when everything changed. March 2003, a quiet suburb outside Sacramento called Fairwood. The Reynolds family had just moved into their dream home. Michael Reynolds was an accountant. His wife, Patricia, taught 3rd grade. They had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 10. On March 18th, around 2 in the morning, Patricia woke up to the sound of their dog barking frantically in the backyard. She nudged Michael awake. He groaned, figuring the dog had spotted a raccoon or something. He stumbled out of bed to check. He never made it to the back door. A man in a ski mask appeared in their hallway. He was holding a gun with both hands, arms extended, completely steady. Professional. Michael froze. The man's voice was almost a whisper, but Patricia could hear every word from the bedroom. Don't move. Don't speak. If you do exactly what I say, no one gets hurt. What happened next would become a signature pattern that investigators would see repeated dozens of times over the next 12 years. The intruder tied Michael up with shoelaces he'd brought with him. Shoelaces. He'd come prepared. He placed dishes and plates on Michael's back, warning him that if he heard them crash, he'd shoot the entire family. Then he went after Patricia. But here's the thing about this particular night, March 18th, 2003. It wasn't the first time the Shadow Hunter had struck. It was just the first time anyone realized they were dealing with the same perpetrator, because 6 weeks earlier, across town in a neighborhood called Riverside Heights, he'd done the exact same thing to another family. Same method, same whispered threats, same shoelaces. The police had initially treated them as isolated incidents. 2 different criminals with similar approaches. It happens. But Patricia Reynolds was sharper than the investigators gave her credit for. While her attacker was in her home that night, she'd noticed something unusual. He had a small birthmark on his left wrist, crescent-shaped. She'd also noticed he walked with a very slight limp, favoring his right leg. When she gave her statement to Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, she mentioned these details. Detective Mitchell's gut told her to dig deeper. She pulled the file from the earlier assault. Different detective had taken that statement. Different neighborhood. But when she read through the victim's description, Her blood ran cold. Birthmark on the left wrist, slight limp. "We've got a serial predator," Mitchell told her sergeant the next morning. And she was right. But she had no idea just how prolific he actually was. Over the next 3 months, Detective Mitchell started connecting dots that nobody else had seen. She requested files from surrounding counties, looking for similar patterns. Home invasions, couples targeted, the shoelace method. And what she found made her physically ill. 23 cases, 23 families, all within a 70-mile radius, all between 2003 and early 2004. The attacks were escalating in frequency, one every 2 weeks, then one a week. He was getting bolder, more confident. But here's what haunted everyone on the task force that was quickly assembled. This guy knew things he shouldn't know. In case after case, victims reported that the intruder seemed familiar with their homes. He knew where the bedrooms were. He knew which doors creaked. In some instances, he'd already disconnected phone lines before breaking in. He was casing these neighborhoods, sometimes for weeks before striking. Neighbors would later report seeing a suspicious man on a bicycle, riding through the area at odd hours. Others mentioned seeing someone peering through windows or lingering near homes. But nobody had called the police, not until it was too late. June 2004. The assault stopped. Completely. Just nothing. For 3 years, the shadow hunter went silent. The task force continued working leads, but they had nothing. No forensic evidence that led anywhere useful. DNA had been collected from several scenes, but it didn't match anyone in the system. Fingerprints were smudged or belonged to the homeowners. Witness descriptions were vague, shadowy, inconsistent. Detective Mitchell couldn't let it go. Even as the department shifted resources to other cases, she kept a file on her desk. She reviewed it every few weeks, hoping something would click, some detail she'd missed. Then, in October 2007, the shadow hunter returned. But this time, he brought a new level of horror with him. Brian and Stephanie Hartwell were found murdered in their home in Modesto. Both had been bludgeoned with a fireplace log. Their 13-year-old son had been at a sleepover that night, which probably saved his life. The crime scene was brutal, chaotic. Blood spatter on the walls, signs of a struggle. But amidst the chaos, investigators found something eerily familiar. Shoelaces, used to bind Brian's hands, and dishes, shattered on the floor beside his body. The shadow hunter had graduated to murder. Between 2007 and 2015, the shadow hunter killed 13 people across Northern California. Couples mostly. People living in suburban neighborhoods with good schools and safe streets. The kind of places where people didn't lock their doors at night because nothing bad ever happened there. Until it did. The FBI got involved in 2008, bringing resources and expertise that local departments couldn't match. They created a profile. White male, probably between 25 and 40 years old, physically fit, likely had some military or law enforcement training based on his methodical approach. He probably lived or worked in the areas he targeted. He was organized, controlled, patient. But the profile didn't help them catch him, because he was a ghost. He left DNA at scenes, sure, but it wasn't in any database. He left footprints, but they came from common shoes sold at major retailers. He left trauma and grief and unanswered questions. Families were terrified. Home security system sales skyrocketed across Northern California. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up overnight. People bought dogs, guns, deadbolts. The psychological impact was immeasurable. How do you feel safe in your own home when someone that dangerous is out there? Detective Mitchell, now promoted to lead the Shadow Hunter Task Force, held community meetings. Hundreds of people showed up, desperate for answers. What can we do? They asked. How do we protect ourselves? The honest answer? She didn't know. This predator was too careful, too patient, too disciplined. And then, in June 2015, the attacks stopped again. Not because he was caught, simply because he stopped. The task force had no idea if he'd moved, if he was in prison for something else, if he'd died, or if he was just dormant, waiting. The case went cold, but Detective Mitchell didn't give up. She couldn't. She'd spoken to too many victims. She'd attended too many funerals. She'd looked into the eyes of too many children who'd lost their parents and promised them she'd find who did this. In late 2015, she heard about a new technique that genealogists were using to trace family trees: genetic genealogy. People were submitting their DNA to public databases like Family Tree DNA and Gene Tree to find relatives they'd never met, connect with distant cousins, build their family trees. Mitchell had a thought. What if they could use the shadow hunter's DNA the same way? It was unprecedented. No law enforcement agency had ever used public genealogy databases to solve a crime. There were ethical questions, privacy concerns, legal gray areas. But Mitchell was desperate, and desperate investigators sometimes pioneer new paths. She reached out to a genealogist named Barbara Cole, who specialized in adoptee searches. "I have a DNA profile," Mitchell explained. "Can you help me find who it belongs to?" Barbara was hesitant at first. This wasn't what the databases were designed for. But when Mitchell explained the case, the scope of the crimes, the decades of terror, Barbara agreed to try. The process was painstaking. Barbara uploaded the shadow hunter's DNA profile to Gene Tree, one of the public databases. She got a hit, not a direct match, but a third cousin. Then another distant relative, then another. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle when you only have a handful of pieces and no picture to guide you. That's what Barbara was doing. She built family trees going back generations, finding common ancestors, then working forward to identify every living descendant. It took months. Mitchell checked in weekly, then daily. Barbara would send updates. "I've narrowed it to 3 family lines." Then, "I think I found the right branch." Then, "There are 7 possible men in the right age range and geographic area. 7 suspects." Mitchell's team started surveillance on all 7. Watching their routines, checking their backgrounds, looking for anything that matched their profile. 5 of them were quickly eliminated. Wrong age, wrong build. Solid alibis for at least some of the attacks. That left 2. One was a construction worker in San Jose. The other was a retired police officer living in Seattle, Washington. A retired cop, Mitchell felt her stomach drop. If the shadow hunter had been in law enforcement, that would explain so much. The methodical approach, the way he'd evaded capture, the way he seemed to understand investigation techniques. His name was Robert James Harrison, age 67. Worked for the Sacramento Police Department from 2001 to 2009, then moved to Seattle where he worked as a security consultant before retiring in 2014, divorced twice, no kids, lived alone in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. On paper, he looked ordinary. A little antisocial maybe, according to former colleagues, kept to himself, but nothing that screamed serial killer. Mitchell needed his DNA to confirm, but she couldn't just ask for it. If Harrison was their guy and he knew they were watching, he might run, or worse, destroy evidence. So they waited, watched, and hoped he'd discard something they could collect. November 2016. Detective Mitchell's surveillance team had been watching Robert Harrison for 6 weeks. They followed him to the grocery store, to the gym, to the pharmacy. They documented his routine, every movement, every stop. And then, on November 17th, they got their break. Harrison pulled into a pharmacy parking lot in downtown Seattle. The surveillance footage shows him clearly, though he doesn't know he's being watched. He gets out of his car, a blue Honda Civic, and walks toward the entrance. He's holding a tissue, dabbing at his nose. Allergies, probably. Just before he reaches the door, he tosses the tissue into a trash can. The moment he disappears inside, one of Mitchell's undercover officers swoops in. He retrieves the tissue, carefully bags it as evidence, and rushes it to the lab. The DNA analysis took 3 days. 3 agonizing days where Mitchell barely slept. She knew they were close. She could feel it. On November 20th, 2016, the lab called. "It's a match," the forensic analyst said. 100% certainty. The DNA from the tissue matches the DNA collected from 17 different crime scenes. Mitchell closed her eyes. After 13 years, they had him. But here's the thing about arresting someone for crimes committed over a 12-year span, crimes that terrorized an entire region. You don't just show up and knock on the door. You prepare. You build an airtight case. You make sure there's no way he walks free on a technicality. Mitchell spent the next 3 months working with prosecutors, organizing evidence, conducting interviews with every victim who was willing to talk. The DNA evidence was solid, but they wanted more. They wanted a confession. On February 24, 2017, a team of 20 officers surrounded Harrison's Seattle home at 6 in the morning. Mitchell knocked on the door. Harrison answered in his pajamas, coffee mug in hand, looking confused. "Robert James Harrison, you're under arrest for the murders of Brian and Stephanie Hartwell and 12 other individuals. You're also being charged with 51 counts of sexual assault and 120 counts of burglary." Harrison didn't say a word. He just stared at her, his face blank. Then, slowly, he set his coffee mug down on a table by the door and put his hands out to be cuffed. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Harrison said nothing at first. He sat across from Mitchell and 2 FBI agents, arms crossed, expression neutral. They laid out the evidence, the DNA matches, the surveillance footage from the pharmacy, the genealogy work that had led them to him. "We know it was you, Robert," Mitchell said quietly. "We have proof, but I want to understand why. Help me understand why you did this." And here's what made it even more chilling. Harrison smiled. Not a big smile, just a slight uptick at the corners of his mouth. "You'll never understand," he said. "None of you will, because you're not like me." That was his only statement. He refused to elaborate, refused to explain, refused to show remorse. But his house told the story he wouldn't. When forensic teams searched his property, they found a treasure trove of evidence he'd kept as trophies, jewelry from victims, photographs he'd taken while surveilling homes, maps with addresses marked, notebooks with detailed observations about families' routines. In his garage, they found the ski mask, the gun he'd used to terrorize dozens of families, and shoelaces, dozens of shoelaces, still in their packaging, ready for his next attack. The evidence was overwhelming. Harrison's attorneys tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution refused. They wanted a trial. They wanted the victims to have their day in court. They wanted the world to see what this man had done. The trial began in September 2017. It lasted 4 months. Victims testified, some breaking down on the stand as they recounted their ordeals. Family members of the murdered victims spoke about the holes left in their lives, the grief that never goes away, the nightmares that still wake them up at night. Harrison showed no emotion. He sat at the defense table, blank-faced, as person after person described the horror he'd inflicted. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence. They explained how genetic genealogy had led them to Harrison, a technique that would revolutionize criminal investigations going forward. They showed the jury the items found in his garage, the maps, the notebooks, the trophies. The defense argued that the genealogy technique was questionable, that it violated privacy rights, that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, but the jury didn't buy it. They saw the mountain of evidence. They heard the victims. They looked at Harrison's cold, empty expression, and they saw exactly what he was. On January 15, 2018, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Victims and family members held each other, sobbing with relief. Some had waited over a decade for this moment. Some had lost hope it would ever come. Detective Sarah Mitchell stood in the back of the courtroom, watching. She didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. She just felt tired. Tired, but grateful that it was finally over. The case of the Shadow Hunter changed criminal investigation forever. The genetic genealogy technique used to identify Robert Harrison has since been employed in hundreds of cold cases across the country. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder decades ago are being identified and arrested. Families who'd lost hope are finally getting answers. But the technique also raised important questions about privacy and consent. When people submit their DNA to genealogy databases, are they consenting to law enforcement using that information? Should they be? These are debates that continue today, balancing public safety with individual rights. For the victims of the shadow hunter, those debates are secondary to the relief they feel knowing their attacker will never hurt anyone again. Many have started advocacy groups working to support other survivors of violent crime. They speak at conferences, they lobby for better victim services, they turn their trauma into purpose. Patricia Reynolds, the woman who first noticed the birthmark that helped investigators connect the cases, now runs a nonprofit that provides free security systems to low-income families. No one should feel unsafe in their own home, she says. That's where we should feel most protected. Charges. Robert James Harrison was convicted of 13 counts of first-degree murder, 51 counts of sexual assault, and 120 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 461 years. He will die in prison. But here's what matters most. The families he destroyed are rebuilding. The communities he terrorized are healing. The investigation techniques pioneered to catch him are solving cold cases and bringing justice to other victims. The shadow hunter thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought he was smarter than everyone. He thought 4 decades of distance would keep him safe. He was wrong. This story is dedicated to the 13 people whose lives were stolen by Robert James Harrison, and to the 51 survivors who found the courage to speak their truth. Your strength changed everything. Your voices mattered, and you will never be forgotten.